Great. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to the organizers, to Baptiste and Christian and Damiano and everyone else that I'm not seeing here. So yes, the talk is called No Parts, No Wholes, and to some extent it's a talk about the status of mereological structure in the face of string theory and in the face of duality relations in string theory in particular. And sort of to give you a sense of the basic question or the basic relevance of this topic for us, we can sort of start by thinking about sort of some classical distinctions that enter often in metaphysics and that are related to questions of mereology in metaphysics, or questions like whether or not matter and space-time are discrete or continuous, for example. And here it is common to distinguish between three views, broadly speaking. A view where one thinks that there is some kind of discrete fundamental entity that makes up everything else. A view where both space-time and matter are infinitely divisible, so some kind of Yankee view, where we can always find some proper part to whatever matter entity we have, and also some proper part to whatever space-time region we have. And then there are variants of various forms of hybrid views in here, where one can have forms of, for example, discrete matter coupled with continuous space-time, for example. And what is relevant for us sort of in this set of questions, that are some classical metaphysical questions, is that they all seem to presuppose some type of commitment to there being a unique mereological structure underlying all these views. The idea is there is some capacity, all of these ways of analyzing the fundamental structure of matter and space-time somehow are committed to the idea that we can always take an entity and there is going to be some unique, well-defined and ultimately metaphysically real way of decomposing it into parts or not being able to decompose it into parts. And we kind of call this assumption, we call it mereological realism for the purposes of this talk. And our claim in the talk is basically going to be that we have some reasonable amount of evidence that string theory complicates matters for this type of mereological realism. So for the assumption basically that there is some kind of unique mereological structure that pertains to the world. And the idea, then in the second part of the talk, we will sort of see that we look at this as some type of challenge to be met, because this then raises the question of how are we ultimately then to make sense of composition in the microscopic world? How are we to make sense of the fact that there seems to be some decently well-defined composed objects, such as a table which is made up of some slab of wood and some legs? How are we supposed to make sense if string theory tells us that in some sense there is no such thing as a unique mereological structure of the world? Now the proposal here is going to be that at a metaphysically fundamental level of description, sort of once we get down to the business of how actually string theory microscopically describes the world, we will have some argument that there is not going to be anything such as a unique mereological ground floor, no unique set of fundamental symbols, whether we want to think of them as extended or not, and there won't be no unique tower made up of these fundamental aggregates. So these are the things that we are going to suggest string theory denies, and which is going to create then this puzzle as to how sort of make sense of some sense of composition then for higher level entities. So to some extent, what we want is that we want to go beyond this notion of mereological realism. We want to say that, as the title sort of suggests, there is no such thing as parts or wholes, that there is no such thing as mereological structure, at least at the fundamental level. There will be no notion, according to string theory, of what it means for things to compose, for things to be simple, for things to make up other things, mereologically speaking. And as I told you before, the kind of case that we are going to look at to sort of make this point are going to be dualities. So in particular, there are going to be two types of dualities that are sort of quite relevant to string theory, which are T and S dualities. I'm going to sort of give you a bit of a somewhat hopefully accessible overview of what T and S duality are. For the purposes of this quick introduction, it suffices to say that they are just some type of equivalence between theories, between different string theories, that somehow seems to preserve all the relevant theoretical content of these theories. And our claim will be that among this relevant theoretical content that they preserve, there is no notion of preserved mereological structure here, or at least there is no unique notion of mereological structure in which these dual theories agree, and so in this sense they seem to erase distinctions between parts and wholes, and more generally seem to erase mereological structure, basically. There is a sense in which strings do not care about mereology. So as I was telling you, dualities are, for the purposes of this talk, equivalences between theories. They feature prominently in string theory. We can find dualities also in quantum field theories, in more sort of mundane, mostly supersymmetric, really, quantum field theories. We can also find, depending on how liberal we are with what we mean by dualities, we can even find very mundane examples of dual theories. Sort of one that you will probably be familiar with is the Fourier map between position and momentum space in quantum mechanics. Now that can also be conceptualized as a duality, so if you're not super familiar with dualities in general, that can be a good sort of background example to keep in mind and to sort of return to when you're confused by some of the more annoying formal features of string theory. Now there is a literature on dualities that is largely too big to really summarize properly in a slide or two, so I won't try. But I will give you sort of some sense of the interpretative options that people have come up with to make sense of what the ontology is that stands behind dual theories. This is sort of there can be slightly more options than this in principle, but these are somewhat the most relevant ones. So the most famous one and probably the most popular one in the philosophy literature is this common core approach, where basically one ends up being committed only to whatever duality invariant content we have between the two dual theories. So again, recall we've said that the duality is an equivalence between two theories, an equivalence which in some relevant sense preserves all the relevant theoretical content. Now the thought of people that endorse the common core approach is that, well, it's an equivalence, it preserves relevant theoretical content, so why not just build a theory that's only formulated in terms of this invariant theoretical content rather than on whatever extra bells and whistles we might have. If you go back to our sort of very simplified example of Fourier duality in quantum mechanics, a common core theory, modulus of criticisms, you can think of the common core theory as, for example, the Hilbert space wave function. And then you can think of the two dual theories as the position and momentum representation of that wave function, the Fourier transform maps between them, and then we can see sort of how the Hilbert space wave function is an invariant of this Fourier map transformation. A second option, which has been sort of quite less popular in the literature, is discrimination. Discrimination is the idea that we are committed to only one of the two duals, as actually given the relevant ontology here, rather than trying to find some invariant description. So again, if you go back to the running example, this would be someone telling you that, for example, the position space representation of the wave function is in some sense real, while the momentum space representation of the same wave function is not real. It's just some mathematical gadget that we are playing with. Now I've put that small adjective of sophisticated because the discrimination approach, as I've stated, has been sort of quite widely criticized in the literature, exactly because it seems to sort of do violence to the basic claim of the duality relation, which is that there is an equivalence. The idea behind this sophisticated label is that to some extent one could envisage a version of the discrimination approach which has been suggested in some corners of the duality literature, where we still commit ourselves to the claim that at the most fundamental level, in some sense, we only deal with invariant quantities along the lines of the common core, but in specific sort of regimes or limits of the theory, we end up being committed to one of the two duals as being preferable. So again, playing with our Fourier duality example, this would be someone telling you that really at the fundamental level there is only the wave function in Hilbert space, but if you take, for example, a classical limit of that, the position representation of that theory is, in some sense, privileged or better than the momentum representation to make sense of the relevant physics. So this would be sort of the idea of the sophisticated discrimination. The last one that we're going to talk about today is very unpopular, as far as I know. It's this pluralism idea, which has been defended by Baptiste and James Reed in a paper on dualities and ontology, at least suggested there. And the idea behind this pluralist approach is just basically that one takes actually, in some capacity, both ontologies of the dual theories to coexist and to both be adequate and irreducible descriptions of the content of the ontology of a certain physical system. This is somewhat harder to explain in terms of our running example, but we'll see later on when we apply to mereological structure that there could be ways of making sense of this. Now, the other, besides duality, sort of the other important protagonist of this talk is string theory. Again, for a somewhat very quick introduction to what string theory is and what string theory says. String theory is a theory of quantum gravity and a unified theory of all the four fundamental forces, so the electromagnetic, strong, weak interaction, and the gravitational force. It suggests that instead of, and it's quantum, so it's a quantized theory, so that's quite nice. It suggests that we should replace particles with strings, extended one-dimensional objects that propagate in one direction. So overall, they are two-dimensional extended objects. These two-dimensional extended objects, for reasons basically of consistency of the theory of anomaly cancellation, basically, they need to propagate in a 10-dimensional space-time. 10D, if you have supersymmetry. Without supersymmetry, it's a 26-dimensional space-time, but you need supersymmetry anyways. Strings are not the only thing that we have in string theory, somewhat unfortunately, given the name. There are also these p plus one dimensional extended objects, which we are going to call p-branes, on which strings can end. So there are like these guys like this. The picture, unfortunately, is not ideal to show six-dimensional objects, but I guess you'll forgive me for that. Branes, there is a way to classify them, so different string theories only admit different types of branes. But the crucial point, again, for us is that branes are extended objects. They don't need to be in two-dimensional. They can be whatever we want up to the dimensionality of space-time to some extent. And they are just places where a string can end. If you think of a string as an actual string, so as a one-dimensional object that propagates in time, then of course you can have it closed, in which case it's fine. But if it's open, you might want, like the strings of your shoelaces, if it's open, you might want to put it somewhere, make it end somewhere. A brane is exactly that. A p-brane is exactly just a place, for us it's just going to be a place where strings can end. Now, moving forward, sort of, we have said that string theory describes these vibrating strings, these two-dimensional objects, propagating in a 10-dimensional space-time. This sort of raises an immediate worry, given that string theory has the ambition of describing the physics of our world. And the quite immediate worry is that, as far as I can tell, we don't live in a 10-dimensional space-time. We live in a 4-dimensional one. The way that one deals with this in string theory is that one takes usually 6 of these 10 dimensions to be compactified, which means that they have a compact topology, the topology of a circle, and that they're very small. And the idea is just that they are so small that to probe them we would need to reach energies which are significantly higher than whatever we can currently probe, or just sort of probe with our eyes, or even probe with something like the LHC. Since they are so high, they don't really affect sort of, the details of these extra dimensions do not affect the physics at our energy scale, which means that we can describe, for all intents and purposes, our world in terms of a 4-dimensional effective field theory, rather than having to deal with a 10-dimensional one. Now again, this is relevant because this is basically a starting point of T-duality. T-duality is an equivalence between two different ways of compactifying these extra dimensions of string theory. In particular, T-duality, the simplest example for T-duality is really an example of a 10-dimensional spacetime where there are 9 uncompactified, so extended dimensions, and 1 compactified dimension which we compactify around the circle. So something like this or this. That's really the only thing that we care about. So this is the extra dimension over which the string propagates. And what T-duality says is that there is an equivalence, again, between a theory compactified on a circle of radius r and a theory compactified on a circle of radius 1 over r, so the inverse of that. The two theories, there is a somewhat precise sense in which one can say that they describe the same physics. There is nothing sort of that one theory says that the other theory cannot say, but they sort of they describe strings as propagating in these two spacetimes with very different values for the radius. So in particular, if you think that one of these dimensions, as we said, is going to be really small, so the other one might be incredibly big. So these are, on the face of them, two very different descriptions for what is at its core the same physics. Now, a relevant bit of sort of additional information that's relevant for us is that also brains get transformed under T-duality. Brains in particular under T-duality go from being odd dimensional to be even dimensional and vice versa. And this again gives you the idea. There is sort of a slightly more technical way of explaining this, we can talk about it. But to get an intuition for this, you can think that if this extra dimension is very small, and we can think of a 5-dimensional brain, for example, or a 1-dimensional, well, a 5-dimensional one is going to be nicer. A 5-dimensional brain as a brain that intersects this very small dimension only in a point, right? But if I now apply T-duality and I blow up this dimension, there is a sense in which that point that I was intersecting this dimension, because again, think of this dimension as being so small that it could very well just be a line rather than a circle, then I can only intersect it at a point, or at least approximately I can think of that as a point-like intersection. If I blow it up, I might very well discover that that was not really a point that I was intersecting my extra dimension at. It was actually a natural circle. So my brain was not really a 5-dimensional brain intersecting the extra dimension at a point. It was a 6-dimensional brain that was going around a compact circle. Now, why is this relevant for us? It's relevant because the way that we recover something like the fermions in the standard model, for example, the chiral fermions of the standard model, one way at least, is by constructing systems of intersecting 6-dimensional brains. Which means that under T-duality, these intersecting 6-dimensional brains are going to get mapped to a system of intersecting 7-dimensional brains. Which sort of quite straightforwardly gives you a sense in which we have two different, but duality related, so equivalent in some relevant sense, mereological descriptions of the same entity. Here it's quite sort of immediate to see because we are talking about intersections of some extended objects. We are saying that in some sense there is this 6-dimensional brains overlap in a certain way, giving rise to certain objects by virtue of the fact that they overlap in an appropriate way, so they share a part in an appropriate way. And then under T-duality, we discovered that actually that overlap was completely different. The relevant mereological decomposition of the fermion is not anymore in terms of 6D brains overlapping, but it's in terms of 7D brains, 7-dimensional brains overlapping in a slightly different way. Moving on to the other example that we're going to be talking about, this is S-duality. S-duality is a duality that while T-duality is a duality that we only find in string theory, S-duality is a duality that you can also find in some quantum field theories. Supersymmetry again helps to make sense of S-duality formally, but the basic claim of something like S-duality is that we have an equivalence between solutions whose coupling constant is G and solutions whose coupling constant is 1 over G. So we are going from a very strongly coupled theory to a very weakly coupled theory and vice versa. It makes, if you're not familiar with this language of sort of perturbation, of the language of perturbation theory, you go from a theory where there are very strong interactions, for example, and so where it's basically mathematically, for all intents and purposes, impossible to do any calculation with it. It maps it says that it's equivalent to a theory with very weak interactions, so where we can actually know how to do all kinds of calculations. So it's, even in practice, extremely useful. Once this is applied to string theory, what it does is that it exchanges, for example, superstrings, so the little strings that we've been talking about, with one-dimensional branes, which annoyingly enough are not strings, because the one-dimensional branes are still composite objects. So the point here is that in general, under S-duality, one thing that happens is that we take simple objects, whatever objects we have, whatever objects are fundamental in a theory, they cannot be decomposed in terms of smaller components, and they get mapped in the dual description into composite objects, objects which are made of the new fundamental degrees of freedom of the dual theory. Vice versa, the fundamental objects of the dual theory get mapped to composite objects in the one that we started with. So we are switching what's composite and what's simple. In the case of string theory, this means that we take the superstrings and we send them to one-dimensional branes, and vice versa. If we go back, we're going to take one-dimensional branes, which are composite, and send them to superstrings. The reason why one-dimensional branes are composite is sort of left as a mystery for now. We can talk about it maybe more in the Q&A if you are worried about that. But again, the example that we can give for what's happening when we're dealing with S-duality is that of a cosmic string, a cosmic superstring. So a cosmic superstring here is just an actual superstring, so one of these fundamental, incredibly small objects that we've been using to describe the microscopic physics underlying the standard model and general relativity. And the idea is that it should be possible, at least in principle, that in the very early universe, these superstrings, some of them, could undergo a process of cosmic inflation. So cosmic inflation is this process by which we take, in the very early universe, some very small patch of space-time, some very small region of space-time, gets inflated into being significantly bigger. So basically our whole universe, the idea is our whole universe, for example, was this very small region, and it got inflated into sort of macroscopic size. And the observation behind cosmic superstrings is simply that, well, just imagine that in that small region there was also a string, exactly at the moment when inflation kicked in. Well, there is in principle nothing that stops the string too to be stretched out to macroscopic sizes, and we might even be able to see in the sky. So in principle, these things can be observational signatures, one can look for them in the sky. And the idea is that there can be cosmic strings which are made up of p strings, so p here is not the dimensionality anymore, it's just a number, and q branes, there is a relation between this p and q, they have to be relatively prime. But the point here for our purposes is not the relation between the p and the q, it's just that the system made up composed of p strings and q branes, and the S-duality gets mapped to the same cosmic string. This thing again has the exact same physical properties as before. It's, for all intents and purposes, the same physical objects. If we look at it in the sky, we see the same stuff. But this time it's going to be composed of q strings and p branes. So we have basically switched what was a brane and what was a string, as we said before when we said that we were moving strings and branes around. So again, there is a sort of quite vivid sense in which we have two different duality-related mereological decompositions of the same entity. We have a cosmic string, which is just an object with some properties that we can characterize, and we can, when we have S-duality, we can think of it as made up of p strings and q branes, or q strings and p branes. Finally, as an example, we are going to go to the sort of even more speculative one, which is F-theory. F-theory, again, for all intents and purposes, is what is called the non-perturbative completion of type 2B string theory. We don't really need to go into the details of what that means. It just means that it's an exact, completely precise description of the physics of a certain kind of string theory. So it's a sort of, it's in some sense a more fundamental description of this. And the important point of F-theory, one of the main reasons why it was developed, is that when we are dealing with F-theory, S-duality becomes a kind of gauge symmetry. So this is sort of what the picture here tries to represent. You can think of this as the spacetime in question of a certain string theory. The idea is that if this is the spacetime of a string theory, what F-theory does is that it attaches a torus like this to the spacetime, and then the observation is that the group that implements the S-duality transformation is exactly the group that defines a torus. So we just add this geometric object as a bundle, as an additional gauge field, whose symmetry is exactly the symmetry group that implements S-duality. So it treats S-duality as gauge symmetry. And then the argument becomes again quite straightforward, because basically to comport with standard views regarding gauge symmetry, we end up having to identify these two different S-duality related mereological structure. So one where we have certain composite entities and certain simple entities, and one where what was simple became composite, and one where what was composite became simple. And they have to be just the same description. They literally have to be identical, because that's the way that in philosophy of physics and in physics, we just want to think of gauge symmetries. Gauge symmetries are representational fluff in some sense. And then this example, if you want, reinforces further the moral that there cannot be any unique, well-defined mereological structure in string theory, because we are again saying that there is a precise sense in which two distinct mereological structures have to be identical on pains of sort of doing something very violent to what we mean by gauge. Now, those were the technical examples with sort of the explanation of how string theory creates problems for mereological realism. Let me sort of switch gears and start talking a bit about how to recover macroscopic notions of composition from this picture. So the idea here is going to be that if there is no unique structure at the fundamental level, then how do we get macroscopic determinate composition? So how do I make sense of the fact that legs and slabs of wood make up tables? This sort of runs in parallel, interestingly enough, to what has been the main topic of discussion in the philosophy of quantum gravity literature in the past few years, which is this discussion of space-time emergence. So we're going to have an option which is a kind of derivative understanding of mereology, which is parallel to sort of space-time emergence views. We're going to have an eliminativist discussion, and then we're also going to have a pluralist option to make sense of macroscopic composition, which is going to be a new option compared to the debate on space-time emergence. So somewhat quickly, because I understand that I don't have that much time left, mereological derivativism is in some sense the most straightforward view. It's going to be the view that composition is going to exist only at very low energy levels, and it's going to be analogous in this sense to space-time emergence. So just like space-time only appears at very low energies, also composition will only appear at very low energies when we can disregard basically the effects of dualities. The duality descriptions will agree on everything, including mereology. So for example, the sense in which tables are made up of some components, that's going to be something in which the two duals will agree upon, even if at more fundamental level, when we start dealing with something like chiral fermions and what brains make up chiral fermions, they will disagree on what makes them up. But since the same chiral fermions will make up a certain table and a chair in both duality-related frames, there will be a somewhat precise sense in which at least these macroscopic composition claims will be derivatively true. So in this sense, again, as I was telling you, T-duality gives us a quite natural example. We can have a fundamental common core and this emergent mereology, because as we go to lower and lower energies, at some point the two duals will actually agree on mereological structure. There is an interesting extension of this idea, which sort of goes in the direction of the sophisticated discrimination view, which basically will kind of start to tell us that we will have derivativism with some kind of contextualist notion, which is going to be implemented in this way. So we might even want to say that upon taking something like a semi-classical limit, there might be some reasonably precise sense in which actually one of the two duals is preferred, at least in a semi-classical limit, and so should be the one that gives us the relevant mereological structure, at least after taking that limit, based on contextual grounds of this kind. And so in that sense, we might even be able to have some sense of mereology, at least when string effects are sort of small enough that we don't need to go to a completely fundamental description. There is a somewhat background worry here, which is that given sort of the fact that we are, once we go to low energies, we are in some sense adding almost extra ways in which things can combine by being able to combine in mereological ways. So being able to enter into partial relations that do not exist at a fundamental level, there could be a worry that at some point this will force us to be committed to some notion of strong emergence, so something that cannot really be reduced to the fundamental ontology. So this is sort of something that we just flag as a potential worry here. Another option, even more straightforward, is just eliminating this notion. We have no holes, no parts, we have no mereological composition at any level of reality, because we just know that at the fundamental level there's nothing, and so it can never appear. We could have various options here, some kind of error theory to make sense of our mereological intuitions. We could just say that we are empiricists, and so we only care about what we can measure, and we cannot exactly measure mereology. And again, this is going to be analogous to some views in the space-time emergence debate that go under the name of space-time eliminativism. Now, the final one, which is going to be slightly more interesting, is this mereological pluralism idea. And this is the idea that already at the fundamental level, so we are going to reject something like a very strong view of the common core approach, because we're going to say that at the fundamental level, there is going to be mereological structure, but it's not going to be unique. So the two duals both describe the fundamental mereological structure of the world, but just not in a unique manner. There are two of them, they all work, they all describe the mereology, but for whatever reason, they both apply. So the world is going to be made up of multiple qualitatively identical fragments. There is going to be, again, this notion of pluralism that comes from the philosophy of duality. And this multiplicity will then propagate in some sense upward to the non-fundamental. The idea here, an example at least as a proof of concept that this is not completely insane, is going to be that we can have a macroscopic composition which is going to be in some sense super values, so in the supervaluationist approach, across different fragments. For example, if I say that this end is a part of my body, this is going to be true in all dual representations, roughly for what I told you before, that all the duality frames are going to agree on the fact that the end is part of my body. And so there will be a macroscopic representation where all duality related mereologies agree on this, and we can then say that it's going to be sort of super true in much the same way in which supervaluationism allows us to say that things are super true when all possible precipitations agree. So in this sense, at the same time, the end and the body will be composed of different entities in the different dual descriptions. One will be made at the completely fundamental level of 6-dimensional brains, one of 7-dimensional brains, strangely enough. But the entities composing the end will compose the body in each description. So there will be agreement regarding the fact that whatever makes up the end makes up the body. So there is a sense in which there is determinacy in composition, which arises from this kind of supervaluation across indiscernible mereologies. And here the idea is that we can go from duality pluralism to mereological pluralism, which is this idea that we have supervaluationism across different decompositions of an entity, which gives us mereological determinacy. So it gives us a precise sense in which it is actually true that my hand is a part of my body. Well, conclusions. So we have seen the incompatibility of mereological realism with dualities. We have given 3 interpretative options to move forward: derivativism, pluralism, and eliminativism. We haven't really said which one should be preferred. And there are, to some extent, further things that one could worry about. So whether there are connections, for example, between pluralism and indeterminacy, given the role of supervaluationism in our proof of concept of that. And more broadly, there is a broad question of what to make of talk of levels and fundamentality in metaphysics, especially when mereology based. And that was the last. Thank you.
Can I upload your?
Yeah. There you go.
Oh.
What is it?
Okay. Okay. So thanks, Baptiste, thanks, Enrico, for that very interesting paper. I don't work on the string theory, but I work on Cinti, and some of my reflections are kind of trying to bring the two things together. Well, but let me start with this. So it was the year 2017, my first conference, my first philosophy conference. A friend of mine in my PhD, Xavi, and some of you might know him, he said, "Oh, you want to comment on, they need a commentator for a paper." And I said, "Sure." I didn't know much, and I said, "Let's do it." And then it was a paper by Baptiste on mereology, on emergence of space-time. And it's funny that 8 years later, I'm again commenting on a paper of you, well, with you now. And it's also on mereology. This time on other things. Here is a proof. I was with Baptiste back there, and Joaquin and Shelley. Anyway, going to the comments, the actual comments. So, as I was reading the paper, I was thinking that there might be like an interesting connection with, like you can make somewhat similar point, and maybe I want to hear your comments about that, with special relativity, right? So you have two frames. Suppose we have, someone is making this chair like from scratch, and you have this part that you have not attached two legs yet, and then in one frame someone attaches the two legs at the same time, right? And then you would say, well, the chair has these two legs, so those two legs are part of the chair now at that time. But in another frame, one sees first this leg being attached and then this leg being attached. And so there is a sense in which there is no time at all in that frame at which the two legs, or at least there is a time at which the two legs were not simultaneously part of the chair. So, sometimes I've seen like discussions about this about corners, right? The corners of objects, like Damiano gave a talk last year on like, actually it was with chairs too, so maybe it was with chairs. Right, like you have different frames, and if you look at how an object is created, in some frames it looks like there's only a corner of the object, and in others there is a bigger part already simultaneously, and like that's the original object exists already, and we'll have to think about that, and so on and so forth. But the thing of the legs, I think, is enough to make the point, and I just was wondering, that's point number one, I was just wondering some of the challenges that you think string theory poses regarding mereology can be found already in special relativity because of this question about when parts are composing something, like different frames might disagree about that. Okay, that was point one. Point number two has to do with the three options that you mentioned at the end to kind of tackle some of the issues like derivativism, eliminativism, and pluralism. So I think maybe there's a fourth option, or maybe this is like a version of pluralism. Maybe you can help me think about this. Like in metaphysics, and for example in the problem of change in metaphysics, philosophers were worried about things like shapes. Shapes seem to be intrinsic properties, but they change over time. And different philosophers like Lewis famously introduced temporal parts to kind of avoid that. But some people say, no, you know what's happening is that the property is not the shape, like a circular shape or square shape, The actual property that objects have are more complex things like square at t or square at 3 p.m. And that whole thing is a property. That's one way you can go. Another way you can go is to say something like objects don't instantiate shapes. They instantiate shapes at times. So the object has a square at 3 p.m. and now like there's a 3-place relation, right? Object, shape, time. It sounds almost the same, but in one case you have one property that is a complex thing and so on. Now, forget about that. Go to more physics practice cases like in relativity again, and you might say one of the lessons from relativities you might say is that length objects don't have lengths, objects have lengths in frames. And similarly, maybe objects don't have shapes, they have shapes in frames. So you cannot just say this is 3 meters, you have to say it's 3 meters in this frame or another frame and so on. So thinking about that, I was considering, well, maybe you can say something like that here, right? Objects don't have, whatever, choose whatever case, and then you say, in this representation or in this model, the brain is composed of, I don't know, whatever, these 2 things or 3 things. Don't know how it works, but in this other representation, it's composed of 6 things instead of 5 or whatever, right? So we learned, the lesson I did that we are learning that composition itself is representation of dependent or model dependent. So we thought we could say, oh, this is composed of these 3 things, period, as we thought we could say this is 1 meter, period, and now we learn, no, you have to say this is composed of these 3 things in this representation. And the representation itself is part of maybe the property or is part of the relation that you need to instantiate. So this, in other words, these things might be analogous to what's happening in the case of frames. But this is not exactly a fragmentalism thing, I don't think, because you're not saying reality is split in these fragments. You are actually, you have one reality, and it's just that the properties you thought it has, like in this case, neurological properties, have little indexes or some sub-representation or sub-model or something like that, right? That was point 2, and then finally point 3, very briefly, and this is maybe a bit more like a verificatory question about the common core approach. So in symmetries, but in more simple cases like in Newtonian mechanics and contexts like that, when you have 2 theories, sometimes they are connected by a symmetry and they agree on all the empirical stuff. Sometimes philosophers of physics say, well, what you have to do is to find a new formalism where you cannot even talk about these 2 models anymore, that they collapse into one or something like that. So when you move from Newtonian absolute spacetime to Galilean spacetime, and you are not even, in some sense, able to attribute velocities or absolute velocities to objects. Maybe you might think, and this I just don't know what's going on in the physics side, maybe you might think, oh, we haven't found a formalism in which this sort of closed structure is just removed. And so maybe the hope is we eventually, or physicists eventually find this formalism. And only at that point we can ask questions about, we can start asking these more metaphysical questions. Thanks.
Yeah, so no, thank you, Sebastian. This was really interesting. So for the first question regarding the chair, yes, so to some extent the 2 cases are analogous, and to some extent they're not. So it largely rests, at least to my mind, on questions basically of the connection between dualities and symmetries, so whether or not you can think of a duality map as a symmetry. The question is somewhat non-trivial to answer, unfortunately. Dualities can be basically analogous to symmetries, but in some sense one level up is the language that, for example, Butterfield and De Haro use. And the idea is that one takes what one calls models an actual theory, so like a whole string theory will become a model, and then one calls theory basically whatever underlying thing that has these two things as model, and then that thing is going to be, the duality is going to be a symmetry of this theory one level up. So there is a sense in which the two cases are analogous in that sense, that there is a sense in which here exactly we have again a symmetry consideration that makes complicated questions regarding composition. At the same time, exactly because we are moving one level up, there's going to be sort of additional complications that come from this fact. So in particular, in some sense, as we start dealing with dualities that become more and more complicated and more encompassing, in some sense we lose any track of what the object even is anymore. So in this case we have some reasonable sense in which you can think of a chair, and we can think of the chair, for example, as a four-dimensional extended object made out of a bunch of certain space-time regions, which at least we can presumably identify. In the duality case, all of this background structure that we can at least appeal in the case of the chair is going to basically just disappear from view. So to some extent I agree that it's a similar situation. At the same time, it seems to me that the duality case is going to be also significantly more radical, exactly because the extent to which we lose background structure when we are dealing with the duality is just so much greater. Regarding the second question, yes, that's actually a very interesting. That's actually a very interesting idea. I agree that one could think of that as this kind of representation, this kind of duality frame dependence, as a way sort of to make sense of what's happening here, in much the same way in which if we run with the analogy with special relativity, one could think of like frame dependence and sort of a way to make sense of the composition of an object. I don't disagree with that. I do think, I think two things about that. One, that to my mind at least the most natural way to make sense of that is going to be as a much more precise version, I think, of what I was calling sophisticated discrimination. So by using basically some notion of semi-classical limit here. In particular, one could appeal basically to the fact that these dual theories often admit distinct semi-classical limits, so one can think of the two duals as really being just the starting point, not really as being like fundamental description, but just being as the starting point to define two different semi-classical approximations. And in that sense, it would fit quite nicely exactly with the idea of that sophisticated discrimination approach. And that would make it, rather than make it be representation dependent in this way, which might be a bit, it might be sometimes complicated. It would make it basically dependent on, it would make it in some sense dependent on the observer ideally, or whatever sort of entity picks out which semi-classical approximation is relevant in a certain regime. So whatever mechanism is behind the choice of a certain semi-classical approximation is going to be whatever fixes the dependence on a choice of representation of these structures. Finally, for the final question regarding the common core, yes, so to some extent, I think that the people, at least who defend this common core idea, tend to think of the common core exactly as that, and it is very much a formalism that in many examples has not been developed. There is some, I have some in progress work for the T-duality case at least. It's so the notion, the sense in which the string dualities are going to give an invariant formalism for them is often going to be quite different, I feel like, again, from the case of symmetries. So in the case of symmetries, there is a very natural sense in which one basically, well, I mean, I guess you can tell me actually if this is what people do, but there is a strong pressure sometimes, for example, with gauge symmetries, to just take something like an equivalence class and look at whatever basically survives that procedure. If one does that with dualities, nothing is going to survive, or very, very, very little is going to survive. What one does is usually somewhat more complicated, so one doesn't really just construct an equivalence class of these things. one tries basically to construct a theory which has enough bells and whistles that one can then construct the two duals from it. So like in the case of T-duality, without going into sort of excessive details, what one does is that one takes one of the two T-dual theories, what takes the underlying string theory of that T-dual representation. One can add an auxiliary field to this theory. So we just enlarge the field content of the theory, and then one can show exactly that this thing is invariant under T-duality transformations, and that if one integrates out the field, one gets the original T-dual. If one integrates out the position operator, basically in the original T-dual, in this enlarged theory, this puts a condition on this auxiliary field which makes it behave like the position operator in the T-dual theory. So one gets both, but it doesn't get them just as an equivalence, it gets them by doing this somewhat annoying integrating out procedure, and then one can sort of build on top of that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we have a little bit less than 10 minutes for the Q&A. Baptiste has a follow-up?
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, just very quick, because I don't want to take a lot of time, but for the second point, I think it will depend on whether you want to construe what is suggested as being a kind of pluralism or initiative. It will depend on whether you can make that being representational or not, the relativization to a model. But I think it will eventually adopt a kind of pluralism or known as initiatism. And for the second thing, the last one you asked why this kind of metaphysics, reaching that way to a more fundamental theory. But I think here it's helpful to compare the situation with people talking about the variations of periodic inequalities. Like it's kind of pre-vertical metaphysics, so we have some results, and we can learn some stuff, right? We can know the world is multiple, even though we will infer quantum mechanics to know exactly what's happening. In one situation, it's like this, with duality, we have some results. To get the full picture of what's happening, we need the more fundamental theory, but still, this kind of duality relation is already putting constraints on what would be the case of fundamental groups. So, yes. Thanks a lot, everyone, to the comments. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. So, one worry I have is that this T-duality requires a compact spatial dimension and U1 isometry. But it seems to me that the consensus is that our universe is has de Sitter geometry, the positive cosmological constant.
Yes.
So it's maximally symmetric and non-compact. Then, if our universe lacks this global U1 symmetry, why are we taking metaphysical implications from this duality which doesn't necessarily hold?
So, I mean, the Sitter spacetime is going to be a maximally symmetric solution or something like the Einstein field equations. Here, we are not using the Einstein field equations in 4 dimensions. We are not using the Einstein field equations in 4 dimensions. We are really using, if you take a semi-classical approximation, you're doing supergravity in 10 dimensions. And ultimately you're just doing a completely different theory. The way you would get the Sitter out of a setup like this, which is a very complicated, actually it's a remarkably complicated technical question in the sense that people don't even know if you can get the Sitter vacuum in 4 dimensions out of string theory. So it's to some extent an actual open question. But the way you would get it sort of schematically is that you would compactify 6 of these dimensions, and then this compact 6 dimensions would give you gauge fields and further effects on the remaining 4, which simulate the cosmological constant. They basically give you, instead of giving you like a flat Minkowski background for the extra 4, they give you the Sitter one. So in this sense, T-duality will still apply to them. So the fact that the Sitter is maximally symmetric in 4 dimensions is also maximally symmetric in 10 dimensions, of course, but the point is that the maximally symmetric solution that we care about is the Sitter in 4 dimensions, and here we are dealing with a bunch of extra dimensions. So that's why we can sort of worry about additional isometries hidden in these extra dimensions. Does that sort of answer to your question?
Yes.
Thanks. So I hope it makes sense, but I was wondering, like, you consider ways to be anti-realist because of the dualities,
Yeah.
but there is also a way to be realist, not about the duality, but if a derivative theory tells you which one of the underlying description was the correct one, then you could choose one or the other as the real right, and the other one just as a useful description.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's possible. To some extent, I think it's certainly possible that would be the sort of, it would be vindicating this discrimination approach, the sort of more straightforward version of the approach, because it would just say, well, actually you were completely wrong. It looks like there are two equivalent descriptions. There was really one. You were just confused about it. The literature on dualities is somewhat taken that as maybe not as a non-starter, but as not the best idea right now to bet on. And I have some sympathy for that view, mostly because these duality maps really look like, in many ways, really look like symmetries. And there is a pretty decent track record of these types of moves being a bad idea if you're dealing with symmetries. So there is a sense in which this looks like a very bad idea also if one is dealing with dualities. There is also a sense in which, absent any evidence that we have a theory like this, it seems unlikely that one will just somehow figure out a fundamental theory which breaks this structure, which is, it's quite strong. It's quite difficult to evade having these things, and if anything, sort of that F-theory example, it's unfortunately a bit obscure, but that actually gives a quite concrete instantiation of how one can even use these duality maps to construct these theories and get a theory which has actually been quite useful in practice in string theory, exactly by, in the case of S-duality, it's somewhat well, easier than in many other cases because there is an actual group associated to T-duality, to S-duality, I'm sorry, while T-duality, a lot of these other, even more exotic than these dualities, do not have a group structure. S-duality does, and so what people have done is that they've just taken this seriously. They're like, this is an equivalence, so we're going to just treat it as such, and they built the gauge theory, and this thing in practice is actually proven useful. So even in the specific case of duality, we do have some reasonable examples where we see that this works quite well. So it's not impossible that discrimination at the end is the day, but I think a lot of people sort of think it's somewhat unlikely at this point.
Okay, last question by me. Very quickly, so you have this sort of relations move, was Bihan, and obviously, so to take care of what's going on at macro level, right? And I guess that you don't want to have true like gaps there. So typically, supervaluations will give you gaps because you have some claims which are not true on all the classifications and of course on all of them. But in that particular case, you won't want that, I guess. So that would be a special case in the sense that you work with supervaluations, but still you don't get gaps.
Yes, yeah. You would just get, so in our case at least, you would get disagreement, I think. Yeah, I agree. You would get, maybe you would get something closer to like standard supervaluationism, so with gaps in the derivativist, I don't know how it's pronounced, view, because there you would say there is this common core theory where there is no fact of the matter as to sort of how this firm is composed, so that remains just us. There's no true or false whether it's made up of 6-dimensional branes or 7D ones, and then one could try to use that to explain then again in that approach the macroscopic emergence of composition by saying, well, sure, yes, but then at some point they all agree on what it actually means for the hand to be a part of the body. Yeah, it's it's a bit unusual in that sense, the one we are looking at, because there is a true value for every proposition. It's just that it's not, they don't agree in every specification, basically.
Excellent. Thank you very much.